Well, I wanted to mention that tomorrow we're going to, in the morning at 10 and in the afternoon at 2, we'll have a session on Shri's explanations on creation in the universe. It's called. It's this manuscript of talks Baba gave to the Meher Ashram boys between December 2nd, 1927 and January 14th, 1928. This is a little insert slip of paper in that manuscript in Baba's own handwriting, as a matter of fact. I don't know how it got there. There are two of these little slips, but it's very germane to what the talk, the lecture is about right at that stage. So probably somebody like Ramju or Chanji had this, is my guess. Anyway, these talks were given to the students of the Meher Ashram, and it was out of the Meher Ashram that the Prem Ashram emerged in March of the next year. And it did so precisely because what was happening as Baba was giving all these talks, as he was right at this time, really exactly this tsunami of love broke over the school. And you may have read about some of this. Ramju Abdullah's book, Sobs and Throbs, is on this topic in a very limited way, though. He's really focusing on one of the students, Ali. But in fact, there are a whole bunch of them. Abdullah Pakraman, boy, came from Persia, was completely overpowered, and Baba said he was experiencing the sixth plane, actually, consciousness. And many others were. You may have met Asfendir Vasali. Did some of you meet Asfendir Vasali? Mm. He died 5 or 6 years ago or something, but he was a Prem Ashram boy who you wouldn't even have heard of very much. But boy, his stories were really something. Mm. So it all came out of the talks Baba was giving at this time. And they're extraordinary talks. They're, one of the surprises is that they're all full of esoteric material, high philosophy. Good morning. Good morning. Like the very beginnings of creation, or secrets of the spiritual path, planes and the skies, and all this, the asmans, which you won't read about in God Speaks. But Baba told them about it. And of course, a bunch of them began to experience it during this very period. And all this profound philosophy to these boys. At the end of them, so many of these talks, he would say, and so the message I want to give to you is love, create prem. Even though the whole talk wasn't about that at all, ostensibly. And they were being overpowered with love at this very time. So it's really a remarkable phase of Baba's work, and it's a remarkable bunch of talks. There's nothing all like it. So that was the topic tomorrow. I've been working on this for years, but really seriously the last couple of years. And while I've been here at Avatar's Abode, that's been the main project I've been involved in. Here are some of the other pages of the original manuscript. They look like this. Tight. It was found in the same go-down, as they call it, in a briefcase along with Infinite Intelligence and Tiffin Lectures. This was the third manuscript contained there that came to light. Okay, well today we're following up on last week. Last week was on the Buddha himself and his fundamental message as best we can gather it. And today it's subsequent Buddhism, huge topic, no way I can possibly go over it all, even if I knew a great deal more than I do. So let me read this. An Introduction to Buddhism, Part 2, Subsequent Developments in Buddhism, the Three Turnings of the Wheel. Among the major world religions, Buddhism is remarkable in the manner and extent to which it developed beyond the point where its founder seems to have left it. While the full history and vast diversity of Buddhism cannot be covered in one session, we will briefly survey early Buddhism, sometimes called Theravada. That's its name today. It wasn't its name then. And the formulation of the Abhidharma, the emergence of Mahayana Buddhism, which first appeared in the great Buddhist philosopher Nagarjuna and the Madhyamika school, and the subsequent emergence of Yogacara, or consciousness-only school. While these three are sometimes characterized as the three turnings of the wheel, sometimes the third turning is identified with Vajrayana, or Tantric Buddhism, best known today as the Buddhism of Tibet. Sometimes that's called the fourth turning of the wheel. This term, the three turnings of the wheel, by the way, which is, you'll hear this a lot, originated in the Yogacara, some of their texts. It's not an original phrase that Buddha said or anything like that.
So that's the wheel of Dharma is distinct from the wheel of causation.
Yes, and I haven't really looked into where this idea of the wheel of Dharma, what it means. I would imagine it probably is related to that causal wheel we looked at last time, in the sense that you go back through the chain. You trace from effect to cause and undo it and negate it all. Does anybody happen to know where the wheel of Dharma comes from, what that idea means? In other words, he initiated the movement of unbinding. I would suppose it probably means something like that, but I don't exactly know.
That's why I saw so many different versions of it on when I was looking for that image. Do you think you could tilt that a bit flatter? This here, here.
This here?
Can it be tilted flatter so we can?
You mean this thing?
Yeah.
Like that?
That's better.
Does that help?
I can see more, yeah.
Yeah. Now, let's see. I wanted to, before jumping into this greater topic, come to what we didn't really get to last time, and that is a little bit of looking at Buddha. And by the way, just chime in, as you know. I mean, speak whatever you feel prompted to talk about. Hopefully it might have something to do with Buddhism.
I have a show and tell.
A show and tell, yeah. Okay.
My brother gave me this many years ago.
I see. Well, the...
It's 400 years old.
Mm-hmm. What is it? What is it?
Buddha.
Oh.
It's from Thailand. He got it in
Wow.
Thailand.
Yeah. Oh, it's beautiful, isn't it?
You can pass it around. You can touch it.
Yeah, good. Yeah.
Thank you.
Good.
Yeah.
Must be a Theravada image, I suppose. So the three major movements in Buddhism, then, we're talking about, or a little bit the fourth, are and I have it written here, the three turnings of the wheel. The original formulation by Buddha, which over the next 400 or 500 years led to a great development in splitting into many different schools of Buddhism. Theravada Buddhism is actually not the right name for that, because that's a later development, but it grew out of this, and it's the representative of this. It can sometimes called mainstream Buddhism or early Buddhism, or there are many different names for it.
Hinayana, that's a small bit.
Well, that's what the Mahayanists called it.
It's derogatory.
It's a derogatory term, yeah. When I was a kid, I learned Mahayana Buddhism and Hinayana Buddhism. I myself avoid it now at Hinayana, as many do, because it's a real put down to people of those, to Theravada Buddhists, because it's the great, Mahayana means the greater vehicle, and Hinayana means the lesser vehicle. So they were, talking about the other kind of Buddhism as the lesser vehicle, which those people would not particularly appreciate.
And Theravada, of course, means the way of the elders.
Yes, yes. That is today, the three great forms of Buddhism would be Mahayana. Well, Theravada is the descendant of this early Buddhism. Mahayana and Vajrayana, which is Tantric, Buddhist response, or Buddhist Tantric movement, you might say. And it's represented in the Buddhism of Tibet. And thus it's a lot of what you'd encounter in the West nowadays. But in terms of the Buddha himself, I just wanted to flip this out there.
So where does Zen come in?
Zen would be part of the Mahayana Buddhism, and it is the Japanese derivative of Chinese Chan Buddhism, it's called, which emerged in China, I think about the 5th century, with the Abhidharma was the name associated with it, and then he was the first of a series of patriarchs. It's one of the great developments. In China, though, it never happened in India. It's unique to China. And there are other forms of Chinese Buddhism that were characteristic developments of China. Buddhism died out in India, or got killed out, actually. It was the Muslim invasions that really wiped out Buddhism in the land of its origin. So now there are a small number of Buddhists there, not many at all. But Baba, of course, said that he was the Buddha, and I just wanted to bring up this question because I think the Baba community, the Baba family, will have to deal with this sort of question sooner or later. How, Meher Baba said, I was Ram, I was Krishna, I was this one, I was that one. And as God in human form, he would simply say it, because he was. But the world sooner or later is going to ask the obvious questions. How could he possibly be these different great prophet figures who appear to have contradicted each other in so many ways? And it's an obvious question. Like Muhammad certainly was not God incarnate by his own account, whereas Jesus was. So how do you actually reconcile all of that? That's a big question. And I don't think we've bothered with the question very much until now, but since we've talked about Buddha, I just wanted to bring it up. And here are some thoughts, general thoughts on the topic. Since I think about this often, I think that the avatar in different advents actually has to contradict himself in what terms of what he said before. And this is a reason for that God simply cannot be understood. It's impossible. And one reason for that is that our thinking is dual, whereas God is non-dual. So the moment you make God the object of a thought, you're already talking about something other than God. God cannot be made an object of thought. So does that make sense? When I say Meher Baba, well, I'm not talking about who he really is anymore, because there's no duality in him. If I actually knew who he was, the universe would vanish from me. And in view of this state of affairs, the avatar always creates a formulation that's suited to the age. But it's like a doctor giving a prescription. Meher Baba himself gave this analogy one time on this question, as a matter of fact. But when the age changes, that old prescription is no longer the right one for the age. And in fact, humanity inevitably attaches itself to the form of what the avatar said. And that form is a falsification necessarily, because it's limited. It's a limited formulation. So I think the avatar actually has to contradict that. He has to create a dynamic of conflict to shake humanity out of its attachment to what he said the time before. So I don't think we need to be worried about seeming contradictions between different formulations of the avatar. I think they're superficial anyway, but we don't have to worry about making Jesus having said what Baba said or anything like that. It's a weakness on our part when we do that. Here's a good example. It's not a metaphysical, but it's in the life practice. Jesus, born in the time of the Roman Empire, confronted with aggression and violence, spread out his hands and let himself be crucified. And he was the very avatar who had stationed himself on the fourth plane, the plane of power. And more than anyone else could have dealt with a problem like that. You know, he could have, boom, the people attacking him could have been turned into dust, you know. I mean, I'm being facetious about it, but the very avatar who was the incarnation of that principle of power did not use it when it came to his own case. And whereas Muhammad, who got to the same point in his career, 10 years he had simply been preaching to the people of Mecca, they were going to kill him. And instead of letting it happen, he fled to Medina and fought back. And he appears to have endorsed jihad, even aggressive warfare. It certainly seems like it. Certainly his Mandalay thought so. So that Islam conquered all the way to, I mean, within 50 years to the borders of India, almost overtook Constantinople, spreading along the southern coast of Africa. So you might say, well, aren't Jesus and Muhammad contradicting each other? Well, it seems, now this is how I would think of this as a clear illustration of this principle. Jesus, born into the Roman Empire, that kind of embodies states and governments under which we have all had to live for thousands of years, right? Always under one government or another government. And basically we have to put up with it, whether they're good or bad. And the Roman Empire was kind of like that. It had good things and had bad things. So Jesus was showing of surrenderance in the higher truth of love. He was exemplifying that principle. But the problem with that, Baba's discourses on violence, like the nonviolence of the brave and the nonviolence of the coward, I don't know if you remember those. Mm-hmm. The problem with urging that course of action, which his followers emulated for a long time. You read the history of early Christianity, and there was one martyr after another. The first 300 years, most of the great figures got put to death. The problem is that it can become the nonviolence of the coward, where you're actually not standing up for the higher truth at all. You're just afraid of getting killed. So I think within Muhammad's case, the lovers of God can't go on getting crucified forever. They have to, live in the world and defend themselves. Muhammad did that. So he checked that momentum and pushed it the other way. A lot of times in Islam it's gone too far, once again. So that's an illustration of what seems to me to be a fundamental principle in these relations of avatars. They have to contradict each other.
The Crusaders sort of snapped out of it, didn't they?
Yeah, well,
Or they turned the other cheek.
That's because Muhammad had inspired the Christians as well.
Oh, okay.
They were doing their own jihads. Yeah.
But I read somewhere in the earlier Christians, particularly those who claim themselves to be Gnostics, some of them were killed or thrown into the jaws of the lion because they believed that would guarantee them salvation.
Yeah.
So there's other considerations too.
Yeah, I mean, it's a complex issue, but I'm just talking about the general principle that the avatar needs to unsettle the formulation that he gave before, because humanity doesn't reach its depth but gets attached to its surface. So when we deal with seeming contradictions between avatars, I don't think we need to freak out. You know, I sometimes, for example, I don't want to get into this, but I'll just illustrate it. I hear a lot of people talking about how in early Christianity they taught reincarnation. Okay, it's a complicated question. I myself am very skeptical of that. But whether it's true or not, why do we want to believe that? I mean, Muhammad didn't believe in reincarnation. I don't think anyone can argue that. This impulse to make other avatars, having said what we like to believe, we shouldn't, you know, have that weakness in our approach to these things. If another avatar said something different, fine, just let it be. So in the case of Buddha, you can see some really clear points where what he taught does not coincide with Baba's, right? For example, he never affirmed the existence of God, and that's a big one, right? He never proclaimed himself to be the incarnation of God or anything else. He said that he was the enlightened one. He had broken the wheel of birth and death. He was freed from this bondage. He did say that. But the kind of truth that he pointed to, for those of you who were here a couple of weeks ago, was very much an impersonal truth, right? There's no personal principle in nirvana that he ever pointed to. Whereas Meher Baba is very personal. It's all about love. The lover and the beloved is the central paradigm. So there's a difference in orientation between the two of them. I notice that in the course of Buddhist history, the personal came in more and more, especially with Mahayana. But you know, for the first 400 or 500 years or so, they never did representations of the Buddha, right? You may know that. There were no statues or anything like that. But around the first century, they would show the wheel, or they would show his footprints, images like that to represent Buddha. But at about the first century AD, you start to get the first statues of Buddha. They're very Greek influenced. And now we have these magnificent statues that, to my eye, are so full of the presence of the Buddha. I mean, don't you think so? I mean, they're magnificent.
And huge.
And huge, yeah.
Literally.
Right. So they weren't shy about it at all when the time came. So I look at that and I think, clearly the personality of the Buddha did not get forgotten. You know, and it carried through. And I personally think his personality bathed that early Buddhism. It was such a powerful presence in the actual experience of the impersonal truth that he was giving. So I don't think that it wasn't there. And as to the point of no God being taught, again, as far as I know, and if anybody can correct me, do so, but I'm not aware that he actually denied the existence of God. I never heard that he was actually an atheist. He simply wouldn't talk about it. You know, remember that analogy last week about the guy shot with the arrow? You recall that? And how Buddha said, if he's shot with an arrow, what if he starts asking who shot the arrow and what clan did he come from and what wood was the arrow made of and all sort of stuff? He'll die before he ever gets an answer. Buddha would not engage questions of this kind. Baba did engage them. The other avatars did engage them too. But Buddha was really showing a path to that formless, unnameable truth. It must have been part of his work. And I think it is related to the portability of Buddhism. He created it in a form where it could cross the mountains and go to East Asia, China, Japan, Southeast Asia, those places. That was a form better suited to spreading to all those places. That's just speculation on that. On another point, Buddha clearly denied the existence of a self. And the word there is Atma, which is the word Baba uses, as all Indians do, for self, the soul. Atma is Paramatma, says Baba. And Buddha said there is no such thing as Atma. It's one of the 3 marks of existence things. They have no self. So you could say, well, there's a contradiction. They starkly contradict each other. Baba's fundamental premise, the drop is one with the ocean, right? The individual self is identical with the oversoul or God. Well, that doesn't work with Buddha now, does it? Because there's no self and there's no ocean that he ever talked about. So that would seem to be a pretty stark contradiction, would it not? But in fact, the self that Buddha was talking about is the false self. And Baba says that too. The false self has to be annihilated, or the illusion of false self needs to be dispelled. So I don't think it's all that hard to come to an understanding where they really don't clash with each other. But that superficial surface contradiction plays a role in the Avatar's work. This is part of my quick response to all this stuff. Do you guys have any thoughts you want to?
Yeah, I agree. It's the false self that Buddha denied. He never said there is no eternal real self. He said all conditioned things are without self.
Yeah.
Of course, all the false things are without self. The
Yeah.
Buddha himself, even with the Theravada Buddhists who try to defend, they never quoted, from the things I read, they never quote that Buddha himself said there was no real self.
Well, we'd have to read all the early sutras, which I haven't done, but I know one of the fundamental truths of Buddhism is anatma, which is no self, and atma is the word for it.
But the thing they quote is all dharmas are anatma. All phenomena are without self. He's not talking about the reals.
Okay, it could be. It could be. I don't know enough. You'd really have to be a Buddhologist to ask to go into these things in depth. Here is anybody else on these
It
things?
just seems to me like he's saying there's no individual self. That
Yeah.
there's that it's oneness, sort of one.
Yeah. Now Buddha again would not create the grounds for saying that, but I don't think either that he denied it. He simply was talking about how to extinguish this illusion. That was his theme. And there is apparently something that you experience afterwards, whoever that you might be, in nirvana. There is a goal there, and here Baba did speak to this point. He, in God Speaks and especially God Speaks, he said that nirvana is in fact the first stage of fana, that is the realization of the nothing. And the moment after it, you have the experience of the I am God state, nirvikalpa samadhi. And he said it was actually Buddha's mistake to have told people about the nirvana, but not to have told them about nirvikalpa samadhi. So that seems to imply that he should have affirmed the existence of some ultimate reality beyond the nothing, apparently.
But what Buddha himself didn't say about the self, it more than compensated by the Mahayana. When we talk about Buddha
we'll come to.
nature.
There's a lot of compensation for all of this that happened. You notice, in fact, on the matter of the Buddha, the personality of the Buddha, the personhood of the Buddha, which he never represented as an incarnation of God or anything like that. Well, Muhammad did the same from a very different background. He was a prophet of God, but he was not God. But any of you remember from last year, we had sessions on this, over the course of Islamic history, especially, it really reached a head with Ibn Arabi, that actually Al-Hallaj and his master Tustari had said things like this too. They started to develop a concept of the prophet that sure begins to sound like the avatar, the Insan-e Kamil, the perfect man, who is the Barzakh linking all the different states of God. They're all connected and joined by the perfect man. It's really quite a glorious presentation of who the Sadguru is, or the avatar is. And I think it will add a lot to our Baba culture when the time comes.
I think the Mahayana Buddhists did the same with Buddha.
Right.
He said he
Right.
already perfected through countless of merits
Right.
and things. He was just showing people the way of enlightenment as an ordinary person. In fact, he was
Right.
already enlightened when he
Yeah.
was there.
Yeah, that happens with Mahayana. So like with the Lotus Sutra, you start to get these perspectives toward the Buddha. So it does seem over the course of time, the movements that arise out of the avatar respond to some of these questions and start to compensate for them in some way.
Was information recorded or oral at the time
About Buddha himself.
about his teachings?
Yeah, there was a great council right after he died, and this was one of the topics. And Ananda, who was Peter, the Erich of that time, I think it was Kasyapa, I forget who was the one who presided over it, but he got Ananda to recite all what Buddha had said. And there was a serious attempt from that time to carry it on through through memory. They were much better at it in those days than we are now. They really had trained their memories. Writing existed, but it wasn't respected very much. That was true in Islam too, in many ways. So it didn't get written down for several hundred years, in fact. But one of the subjects that I think Buddha's original formulations really will add a lot to our Baba culture with, in my opinion, is what he had to say about the 12 nidanas. Remember that? The wheel. Let's see if maybe I didn't copy that onto here. I did. I guess I didn't. No, I didn't. But that wheel that you were wanting to look at, the chain of causation, and the idea of pratitya samutpada, or dependent arising. This is because that is. This is not because that is not. This ceases to be because that ceases to be. This is the only avatar I know of who really expressed that idea fully, and it's a very deep one. And I'll put it this way, within the order of creation. Buddhism doesn't have creation. There's no creation story. There's no belief that any such thing happened. The world just is. That seems to be the general Buddhist point of view on this. But I'll say, within the order of creation, nothing stands alone. Everything that exists always already depends upon something else. Again, I'll mythologically say, even if the first thing that ever was created in the creation of the universe, which of course isn't there in Buddhism, but I'm saying that, the moment the first thing was created, there is always already something else. Things are always dependent. There's the figure of three sticks leaning against each other. You remove one, it falls down. This is a really fundamental idea in Buddhism, maybe the most fundamental idea of all. Everything is dependent. And now the way that the Buddha applied this was toward the domain of experience, and that really does seem to have been his focus. He was not addressing himself to matters of ontology, which means what exists. He was not metaphysics. He wouldn't talk about those things. He was talking about experience and the problem of suffering. So he applied it that way, pratitya samutpada. Everything we experience always comes dependent on something else. So you have this chain of causation that creates the wheel of karma that spins on and on and on and on. That focus is there. But it occurs to me that this is a principle, since I'm talking about it tomorrow and it came to mind, that could get applied to, other things, not just to this phenomenology of experience, but to creation and to ontological questions, to what exists. And I just wanted to read this little thing in Baba's handwriting that we found in this course of his talks to the Mihirashram boys. I'll read the transcript. In Atma, there is knowing and finite form, space. And when it awakes, these two things become manifested. When manifested, the space becomes most finite. Why? Space is opposite to Darya. Darya means ocean. So finite is equal to infinite, or opposite, equal or opposite to infinite. Atma is infinite, so naturally the first form is most finite. Okay, I would have to talk about this a long time, but it occurs to me that the account he is giving, if you read the whole thing, he's talking about prana and akash, seems to entail a kind of dependent arising. Things arise this is before there's been any drop soul, before any Atma is identified with anything. They arise in dependence on each other. There's a dependent arising.
I think it's more to do with mind, because the Yogacara school said the mind creates everything. The Buddhists always said everything is created by the mind. I think here Baba talked about the infinite mind creator.
Well, whatever there may be there's a duality that arises in coordination with each other. Wouldn't you agree?
Nothing comes from nothing. I think
As a
it's
dependent
not where
arising.
Baba. Yes, but it's within the mind. Mind as the creator. The Buddhists do talk about it, like Yogacara school. All
Yeah.
dharmas are created by the mind.
Okay, well, I'm just flipping this out there as a principle of dependent arising seems to me could be brought into Baba's creation account or to Baba's ontology also, even though Baba himself never enunciated that principle as such. This is all just about the interrelation between avatars and how we can begin to understand them as time goes on. So, anybody want to observe opine anything else? Do you want to opine, John?
I'm wondering about the how many wheels will turn in the Baba world of the future. What will come out?
It makes, like, I know I have that question too. It's like when you look at Jesus and look at Muhammad, it seems apparent to me that Muhammad is a response to Jesus in so many ways. And Baba, we could talk about Baba as a response to Muhammad. But it seems to me like Baba's the end of the road. There's nothing beyond Baba
Baba
that could
turns
ever...
all the wheels at the same time.
Because it's the end of the cycle of cycles, so there may not be any more
You,
wheels.
you just look at his teaching. You just look at Baba's teaching. He, like the Buddha, he takes like 3 or 4 turns for even the metaphysical formulation to be complete. The same with the theistic tradition, the Judaism, Judeo-Christian tradition. It only when somebody made a kind of analogy, they say God the Father is a bit like the Judaism, the Father. Then when Christ came, God the Son. But then when Muhammad came, God the Holy Spirit. So the impersonal aspect, Muhammad really emphasized. So it takes 3 advents for them to complete the wheel turn.
So
Well,
you think,
Baba gave us everything this time.
you know, but I predict, I can safely make this prediction because I'll be dead long before it happens.
You have to come back to contradict your prediction.
Face the music.
That by the time 700 years goes by, we'll have the, how do you say, the limitations of what Baba said
Yes.
will also have manifested, even though we cannot imagine it now.
Only in apparent metaphysical formulations,
Yeah.
not in the path itself and in
Well,
not
no,
in the essence of his
no, I
teaching.
mean, that's true, that's
True of all.
That's true of all of the avatars. And like I remember reading when about Muhammad and the things people said, it's like they had never heard anything like this. The voice of God was speaking in the Quran, and it was self-evident truth, and nothing more was needed. And Islam has taken the Quran to be to have everything, to be the totality all expressed. That's how they experienced it. But now, when we look back on it, the age has made it look so different because we're looking at it superficially. It actually was an expression of the total formless truth. But the form of it gets dated. And I'm sure that will be true for Baba too. It's sort of unimaginable to me now.
But Baba himself provided. For example, when Buddha came, almost what he gave initially was what Francis said, the sun path, the masticating path, that really renunciation, confront your ego, all this sannyasam path. Then the feminine side, the bodhisattva came, the bhakti side. Baba did in his lifetime. First he gave us the path of love, bhakti. Then in the new life, he introduced the renunciation. I
Yeah.
feel Baba is complete. He's at the end of the cycle. There's not
Well-
a great deal to add to Meher Baba.
Yeah, I'm with you, Tian.
He's unique. He's the end of the cycle.
You're saying that Muhammad, Islam was very impersonal, and yet the Sufis have really gone into they talk about the beloved,
Yeah.
don't they? It's kind of like slipping into Baba.
Oh yeah, they found the personal also.
Yeah.
Yeah. I know love was not, that word and that idea was not strongly emphasized in the Quran at all. Mercy is, which is close, but love did come into the story very strongly with the Sufis. Rabia Vajra was one of the first figures. So these different religions do tend to respond to missing elements, so to speak. over
All the
course of-
people around Muhammad, they sacrificed, they died for Muhammad. If that's not love, what's that?
No, certainly love was there, but what I'm saying is that it was not part of the message as formulated very much. It was not an emphasis at all. So, in any case, in 700 years we can see how Baba looks. That'll be interesting to find out. So now coming to these three turnings of the wheel. Again, this is an idea that emerged much later. The three turnings of the wheel of Dharma refers to a framework for understanding the sutra system of teachings, the Buddhism originally devised by the Yogacara school. It later became prevalent in modified form in Tibetan Buddhism and related traditions. And these would just point to the basic structure of this whole thing, this whole session we're having. The first turning actually refers to the Buddha himself. I have to change this. Out of which early mainstream Buddhism arose. And one of the things we'll be coming to in this early mainstream Buddhism, and I wrote it up there too, the Abhidharma. That was the early systematization of a kind of philosophy derived from the early teachings of the Buddha. And that plays a big role in the Abhidharma. It plays a big role. Have you heard of Abhidharma before? The Abhidharma.
Mm-mm.
These great systematizations. the early teachings of Buddha as they understood it. I'll say more about that in a minute. Then in around the beginning of the Common Era, the first century, say, no one knows exactly when, Mahayana arose. And the great philosophical movement associated with its beginnings is called the Madhyamika. The Madhyamika means the middle way. Everything is called the middle way. And the great giant associated with that school, the Madhyamika, I wrote his name up there, is Nagarjuna. Nagarjuna. One of the greatest philosophical figures in the history of Buddhism, without a doubt. And some of you may be acquainted with the idea of shunyata. Have you heard of shunyata? Emptiness. Shunyata. If we had a lot of people who are associated with Mahayana Buddhism, and I think Tibetan Buddhism too, isn't shunyata absolutely central to that?
Yeah. Right.
Emptiness. This idea of emptiness really came into the foreground with the Madhyamika school, and Nagarjuna was the greatest formulator of this idea. One of the big developments within Buddhism. Emptiness. They didn't have God, but they certainly had emptiness with a capital. Well, maybe he would not acknowledge a capital E, but I would tend to make it a capital E. Several hundred years after this, emerged another major movement within Mahayana Buddhism, and that is Yogacara. I think it said Yogacara because it's a long A. Does anybody know? I've always said Yogacara, but I think it's Yogacara.
Well, I'm going to ask it's all to even syllable.
The A is long, Yogacara.
Yogacara.
I think it's, I've never lived in a community where people talked about these things. It's always been books for me. But that is associated, I wrote their names here, especially with two great figures, Vasubandhu and Asanga. I should actually put Asanga first because he was the older brother. There are two brothers. Half brothers, yeah. Who are associated with the formulation of this. And this is called sometimes the consciousness only school or the mind only school, or I've seen it also the representation only school. There are a lot of disagreements now about the precise significance of all these things. This took a view that consciousness is the entirety of the human subject or the human being can be explained purely with reference to the consciousness of that person, which need have no reference to any kind of an external world. I'll come back to that. There are disputes as to whether Yogacara affirmed the existence of an external world or if it said only consciousness exists. Nowadays people fight it out on that question. And then Vajrayana is the, which emerged about this time, but really came into flower in the 7th or 8th century or so, is related to the Tantric movement that arose in Hinduism. Now, a lot of us today associate Tantra with what's called the left-handed Tantra, and sort of like colorful practices like sexual practices and things like that. Magic, yeah. And black magic sometimes in the left-handed Tantra. That caught on in the West, so it got a lot of press. And that is one aspect of Hindu Tantra. But Tantra is not just that. It actually, okay, I won't try to explain about Tantra, we've got so much else to do. But this was a Buddhist development that was related to that. And you can see it in, say, Tibet with the stories of Milarepa, you know, some of you the stories of Milarepa, and the miraculous powers that he exercised all the time. There's Tantric movements in general brought the macrocosm into the microcosm, the divinity, the divine powers, to realize them through the course of an individual's existence.
And
So-
to clean them up, isn't it?
Yeah, done properly, one cleans them and purifies them. Yeah.
Mainly to activate the energy within the human body.
Yeah. So in Tibetan Buddhism is the main place where one finds this. So these are some of the.
Warren, so you said the second turning, the Mahayana?
Yes, but in particular the Madhyamika, which was the first great
And you were
philosopher.
saying that was about the 1st century?
Yeah.
So that would have been the avataric advent of the Christ then?
Yes, right at that time.
Yeah.
And there'll be more to say about that.
Oh.
Presently. There may be a connection. Could be.
It could be part of Jesus Christ's inner work,
Yeah.
inner universal spiritual work.
Yeah. So that's the overall picture of this thing of the 3 turnings of the wheel. Again, remember that this is an idea that arose with Yogacara Buddhism, and I don't know if you said this to a Theravadan, they might not like it. I don't know, because they probably wouldn't acknowledge the idea. I'm just using it as a general chronological framework for looking at this early Buddhism. And of course, the story of Buddhism ends with about year 1000, because that's as far as I go. I was a medievalist. The last 1,000 years are negligible to somebody like me. So,
Except for Bob.
huh?
Except for Bob.
Except for Baba. It starts up again in 1894. No, actually, naturally, I take a lot of interest in that, but I don't begin to know enough about what's happened to Buddhism over the last 1,000 years.
Well, can I ask a question here? It keeps
Yeah.
recurring for me when you explain how things kept getting explained and re-explained and re-explained
Yeah,
about the Buddha.
yeah.
Who are they being explained to? To the followers who come along going, what have you got? You know, what's going on here?
Well, these were developments within Buddhism, and there were monastic orders in Buddhism.
So people are already in there.
Yeah, the Sangha. Remember, they're the 3 jewels. Did I put it here? Oh, I did. I forgot to put it in. But I seek refuge in the Buddha. I seek refuge in the Dharma. And I seek refuge in the Sangha. And the Sangha is the community, but particularly the Buddhist orders. So they got intensive training. It wasn't just theoretical. There was meditative practice. Meditation was a big part of Buddhism, coming right from the time of the Buddha, it would seem. Buddha's advent was much more, this is me talking, it seems like it was much more jnani, knowledge focused. Jesus was much more bhakti and love focused. Love is really there, I'm not denying that, but ostensibly Buddha was explaining things. Baba said he was stationed on the 5th plane. He was giving an account of the falsehood of the self. But here's one little story about the life of Buddha, which I wanted to mention earlier, just to, the compassion and love of Buddha himself was really a huge part of his story. And you may know this story about the mustard seed. Do some of you know the story of the mustard seed? When I first heard of Buddha, and I thought myself a Buddhist for about a year or 2. I was a very half-assed Buddhist, but I took my half-an-ass quite seriously. But there's a woman who came to Buddha with a baby who just died, and she was absolutely distraught. And she wanted Buddha to bring her baby back to life. And you're making poor woman, you know, the heartbroken over this little child. So Buddha said, okay. He said he would help her. And what she would do is go get a single mustard seed, you know how small mustard seeds are, from the house of, from a household where no one had ever died. So she said, okay, so she went around and went to one door and asked for a mustard seed, and they said yes. And then she said, has anyone ever died in this household? And then, oh yes, so-and-so died. And when she went to the next one, again, someone had died there. And every house she went to, someone had died. And by, you know, I mean, I'm just imagining this. She knew what death was because she had lost her beloved baby and was in a position to be more responsive when she heard that someone else had died because she knew what that was like, right? It was not just an intellectual exercise. So at a certain point she realized death comes to everyone. This is a part of the reality of things. And so she went back to the Buddha and he said, so did you bring a mustard seed? And she said, no, but I would like to join the order, right? Now, isn't that beautiful? What a way of answering that situation. Did he give her a pious lecture about, you know, life is suffering and death comes to everyone? No, he did it in a way where she would get it in her heart and head both. So there's so many stories of the Buddha like that, of his compassion and the wisdom with which he dealt with people, like with all the avatars.
I think that's what really distinguishes the real from the false,
Yeah.
or avatar. These stories, the life they lived. And can I share a small story? You know, Baba said he came to do away with rituals and ceremonies. Same with all the avatars. At Buddha time, a Brahmin came and said, Reverend Gautama, do you go to the river something, Hula or something, to bathe? What for? So, to cleanse yourself of your sins. Buddha says, full of dark deeds may go to these rivers and bathe every day. They would not clean themselves. But if you avoid doing bad things, like envy, hatred, and you're clean every day. You're clean automatically. So that's real observation. It's so similar to Baba. That he's not into rituals.
When you just told that other story, I thought, well, Baba would send someone to every house to look for a mustard seed. That's how he taught.
Yeah. There's actually a story of Baba in the 50s, much reminiscent of
Yeah.
the story of mustard seed. So now, let me see. Here, I just want to remind you of some of the fundamental ideas. Remember these 12 nidanas, the 12 links in the chain? That was in that wheel we saw. And this is the most important development of the principle of dependent arising, pratitya samappada, right? Dependent arising. Everything arises always already dependent on something else. And this is that cycle that we go through in our experience, right? Ignorance leading to samskaras, leading to consciousness, leading to identification with name and form, leading to reaching out through the 6 organs of discernment, the 5 senses and the mind, leading to contact, leading to sensation. And this is where Trish happens, the line of escape. I forgot to reproduce that drawing. Remember the line out. Leading to desire, leading to attachment, leading to bhava, or becoming, leading to birth, and leading to death. Remember that wheel. That's the wheel we're enslaved by. So this is, this whole list of 12 didn't get, it comes from a later period, but it seems to have been part of, implicit in Buddha's teaching from the beginning. Now here's what, I mentioned this last time, here's what the self is in the early Buddhist account. It's a 5 heaps, or 5 aggregates, they're called. 5 skandhas is the word, 5 skandhas. There is no self there. It's just this collection of things that are associated with each other. And the Buddhist project is to recognize the falseness of all of this. It disappears, and then the achievement of nirvana happens there. So there's the outer form, there's sensation, there's cognition, there are mental formations, and samskara is the word used for that. Sanskara would be the more modern form. And consciousness, vijnana. This collection of things comprises the false self. Right? I mean, these are ideas that carried through ever after. This is a fundamental Buddhist doctrine, the three lakshana, or the 3 marks of existence. Now, existence means every existent thing has these 3 marks. They are all impermanent, they all are suffering, or dukkha is the word, which means like unsatisfactoriness, right? And they have no self. Anatta or anatman would be the Sanskrit version of it. Everything is impermanent, everything is filled with suffering or dukkha, and everything is selfless, is soulless, without an intrinsic nature. Another basic Buddhist doctrine from the early years. And Buddhism, in its early history, it began to spread slowly, but got an enormous boost under the Emperor Ashoka. I'm sure some of you have heard of Ashoka, the great king.
Hotel.
There's a hotel. Yeah, he got named after the hotel. Yeah, there is an Ashoka. There's an Ashok everything in India, because he's such one of the really great kings of India. Another would be Akbar in the 1500s, died 1605 or so. I suppose you could say Shivaji was. He was kind of an insurrectionary character, but one of the greatest. And he had been a conqueror and had unified much of what is today India for the first time. This was the period of the formulation of great empires. Alexander the Great had, just before Ashoka, done this, of creating a Greek empire, which was then recapitulated by the Romans. In China, just shortly after this, much of China, for the first time, got unified under the Qin dynasty, which only lasted for about 20 years or so. But after its fall, it was immediately recapitulated by the Han dynasty, which lasted for 400 years. So we have great world empires coming into existence at right this time. And after one of his great victorious battles, this is the story in 260 BC, the story is that Ashoka looked at all the bodies of the slain and that he was responsible for, and felt a great regret for this, and in consequence became a Buddhist. And he became the greatest disseminator of Buddhism. So that by the time of his death, Buddhism was a great religion in India, maybe the leading religion, certainly a great religion there. So he would be comparable to, say, Constantine in Christian history, who also converted to Christianity, and all the Roman Empire, what had been a bit repressed until then suddenly became the dominant religion. There wasn't any repression anyone talks about with early Buddhism, but it certainly became the great religion of...
What's he holding in his hand?
Cow.
That's a cow.
I don't know, it must have a significance. I don't know what it is though. I mean, I think Buddha's, Hindu Dharma is characterized as a cow, so maybe he was in a Hindu mood with his left hand when that painting got drawn.
In that, Baba had mentioned that Shivaji was a minor incarnation of the Avatar.
Right.
Did he ever mention of any of the other great leaders or kings of India?
No, I've never heard that he did.
Hmm.
He praised Akbar, I know that. I don't know where he ever said anything about Ashoka.
Hmm.
But he looks like he must have been a very, very great man,
Hmm.
you know, to have played that role that he did. And so, a lot of, there was a first council in Buddhism right after Buddha died, and under Ashoka, actually there was another council about 100 years later, before this, and Buddhism broke into different sects with that second council, and the issue was not a doctrinal one so much, but a matter of what's called the Vinaya, which is the disciplinary rules governing the monastic orders. Remember, these were monastic orders, so you know what in retrospect looks like a triviality is a huge big deal when you're living there. Like, does the Avatar's Abode gate get closed at 10 o'clock? No! Or is Mehrabad going to extend its curfew from 10 to 10:30? Oh no! You know, when you're actually living there, it's a very big deal. But when you look back in retrospect, it seems like this is what they're quarreling about. So if you can remember that it mattered to them. One of the questions was whether monks could take money. That was one of the big issues that happened. So you started to have the breaking apart into different Buddhist sects. So by the time of 500 years had passed, there are traditions said to be 18 of them. But they began to have doctrinal differences also. But there was a third council under Ashoka, and he did start to make an attempt to have some of the Buddhist teachings written down. At least there are reports of that. I don't think we have any. Actually, I don't know what the earliest manuscripts. They wrote on palm leaves, which seems to me to be, deteriorate. So I don't know what the earliest ones are. But the Buddhist Tripitaka is the term. I'll write this word up. Started to really get written. We have written versions of it that date from about I think the 1st century BC or AD, I forget, like the Tripitaka. In fact, I think I have a slide that has this. And the Tripitaka, it's like we're talking about scriptures, in Christianity. It's the Gospels and the Bible more generally, and then Islam is the Quran. For these early Buddhist schools, it would be the Tripitaka.
The three baskets.
The three baskets, yeah. That's the name of it. The three baskets comprising the Pali canon of Buddhist scripture include the following. The Vinaya Pitaka, setting forth the discipline it should be expected of monks. That's what I was talking about earlier with this first conflict happening over a matter of monastic discipline. To the Sutra Pitaka, or Nikayas. The Sanskrit ones are called the Agamas. It refers to basically the same thing. These would be Pali, comprising discourses, some of them with the words of the Buddha. So these early sutras are where you would find accounts of what Buddha himself said. And the third would be the Abhidharma Pitaka, a systematization of Buddhist doctrine. This would not be things that the Buddha himself said, but theorizing, an attempt to come up with a philosophy accounting for the entire world of experience. So the Abhidharma is one of the foundations of Buddhist philosophy. And forever after, really, even people who rejected it. Here's I don't know if you can see this, but this is one graph showing some of these early Buddhist schools. The early Buddhist schools, there isn't really a great name for this. I've heard mainstream Buddhism, because it was that for 500 years. And Theravada was one of those schools, and it emerged, as this chart shows, about 250 BC. And Mahayana first appeared something like 100 CE. And it grew very rapidly, and it was really the Mahayana mostly that went north and east to China, and actually China. East, we have a lot of the Theravada Buddhism went there. And Vajrayana Buddhism, which is the Buddhism we have in Tibet, it emerged around 500, but really started to flower after that, 700 to 800 or so. And down here you'll see some of the like Chan Buddhism, which is the Chinese Buddhism, school of Buddhism that many people now know from its Japanese derivative, Zen Buddhism. So there's a little picture of the history of the schools. It's very, very complicated. There are so many different schools, and I've been trying to get to know them a little better. But the Abhidharma doctrine centers on, I wrote right there, dharmas. The word dharma, which takes on a very different meaning at this stage from what we had before. You know, in Hinduism, any of you read the Bhagavad Gita, say, or the Ramayana?
Yep.
You know how there, like the Ramayana is really centered on the topic of dharma, where Ram behaves dharmically. He behaves doing fitting, proper behavior for a king. You know, it's like duty, but much, much more. Duty is a woefully inadequate word. Acting in a way that is fitting for your station in life, for your age, for your role, and performing rightly in that setting. Well, in Buddhism, when you talk about I seek refuge in the Buddha, I seek refuge in the Dharma, I seek refuge in the Sangha. There, Dharma means something larger. It's Buddha's formulation of the truth. And, there's a lot we could say about this. But in Abhidharma, it comes to mean something else. A dharma is sometimes translated as a factor. In the analysis of experience, the Buddhist analysis of experience based on, you know, the Buddhist understanding of dependent and arising and all these things, they found all these elements or factors relevant, giving rise to experience. Let's see, I'll read a little bit of this. Other uses of dharma include dharma, normally spelled with a small d, which refers to a phenomenon or a constituent factor of human experience. This was gradually expanded into a classification of constituents of the entire material and mental world. So it's starting to be a philosophy to account for everything. But it's not an it becomes an ontology out of, ontology is a study of what exists. It reaches in that direction really out of a phenomenology, out of the Buddhist account of experience. It's experience-centered. Buddhism always remained true to this starting point. Buddha's focus, are you following what I'm saying here? His focus was on suffering and the experience of suffering. So this analysis was true to that in that it's looking at all the factors that give rise to the universe of experience. So when you look at some of these dharmas, they all have that. It's like different from physics, which would look at, say, atoms or molecules or electrons or neutrons or protons. That's not starting from things that we experience. It's starting from things that our physicists believe to exist. But this was all experience-centered as its starting point. Right? Is this making sense? The character of the Abhidharma?
Mm-hmm.
I'll give you a few lists of these.
Who decides what is dharmic? Let's say in a sangha,
Yeah.
if somebody is doing something and the elders might say, well, you are not doing this in a dharmic way.
Well, that's the other use of Dharma, not this one. Let me give you, here are some lists. I this morning tried to dig up some of them. Okay, I know there are huge, huge lists of these things. Abhidharmic categories. This is from the Theravada school. The 10 Mahabhumikas. Mental factors accompanying every thought. These are factors, the factors of large extent, Mahabhumika. That is, basic or general. Now remember, this is kind of like a science, right? So you learn these categories. It's like if you're studying to become a doctor or a lawyer or something. It'd be part of the discipline that you would learn. Feeling, vedana. Notion, samgya. Volition, cetana. Contact, sparsha. Attention, manaskara. Desire. Inclination or aspiration. Mindfulness, concentration. Comprehension. I know we're not going to be able to understand these, but there's vast analysis of all these things in these Abhidharma manuals. I downloaded one of these and it's 400 pages long.
So is this what a follower would not do? Or not
Well, not do, or it sometimes indifferent as to whether you do it or not. It's an analysis of the universe, which means the universe of experience, and what are the factors giving rise to it. It's like that.
So, for example, just given a single thought that you might have, all those factors figure in that thought.
Right.
They're sort of like underlying assumptions that the thought is subject.
Right. And
Do
that
we
help.
get carried by the thought, or
They
can
give.
we get a grip on the thought and say, no, well, cancel this out, cancel this out?
You know what I would
Well,
say?
You can deconstruct the thought into all these different.
Yes. Or in fact, let's use this phrase
Mental.
that help to give rise to the thought, right? Dependent arising, that's the doctrine. Everything is arising dependently. What does it depend on? These are the various factors constituting it.
And what's the value in being able to deconstruct a thought?
You could undo your tendency to sloth, for example.
Yeah.
I suppose if you have a good analytic understanding of it, you can pursue Buddha's way better. It's part of the science of. I'm not an early Buddhist, but
It's kind of like a stepping
yeah,
back, like that thought would arise.
So you
Never
understand-
again in that way because
Right. right,
you've unpicked it,
yeah,
seen its absurdity or something.
right. You'd see what the falseness of it, because all of these, in a way, it's. Let me compare it to atomism. You know, in early Hindu philosophy. And Buddhist philosophy had some of this too, and in early Greek philosophy and Roman philosophy, there are schools saying that everything is composed of atoms. These aren't atoms like when I studied them, atoms had electrons, neutrons, and protons. Since then, the universe got a lot more complex, and there are all sorts of other things too beneath that. But we don't, the idea of atom was not that. Atom was the primordial particle. It's like a marble, that everything is constituted of it. That's how the Greeks and the Romans and the Indians too, and some Buddhists. That's what the material world is made of. Okay, so this is a materialistic model for what the world is, right? Well, the Abhidharma is different than this. You could look at these in a sense as being the atoms, but here's what it's different. They're not things, they're events, they're happenings, and none of them exists independently. All of them are dependently arisen, right?
So they're abstractions, but they're also verbs.
Yes, they're really more verbs. Yeah, verbs created by these sets of conditions. And if you remove the conditions, they disappear, right? You see the difference there? This is actually true to the Buddhist starting point. It's phenomenological. So the Abhidharma is giving an analysis of all these dharmas arisen from these various conditions. And if you look at the, various things, I mean, I'm not an early Buddhist or such an expert, but there would be like, okay, the 6 factors accompanying every defiled thought. Now, defiled thoughts are the things that would keep you from the realization of nirvana, right? Of the dispelling of the illusion of the false self. So kleshas would be the word for a defilement. To the extent, klesha mahabhumika. Klesha is a fault or a sin or a
Maha is
defilement.
big.
Big, and bhumika is a world.
Yeah.
So Mahava, on a big extent. They are confusion, negligence, mental dullness, non-belief, sloth, and frivolity. There was a lot of number 6 over at the Isaac Young's residence last night.
We could use more of frivolity in this day. The word, where's wanting in this picture? I mean,
Oh, I'm sure it's there. I'm sure it's there.
the
Right?
Buddha taught how wanting leads to suffering.
Yeah. Well, this is like a development on, I'm sure in these Abhidharma manuals they could trace it all the way back to there. These are quite thorough and systematic.
If it wasn't in one manual, it'd be in another one.
Yeah. I'm just giving you little snippets to give an idea of what these things are. But no, that's like in the 12 Nidanas, that would be, one of the primary starting points of that. Craving is right there in the beginning of it. Okay, here, the 2 unwholesome factors of large extent. Akusala mahabhumika. The factors accompany every unwholesome thought. These are called the unwholesome factors of large extent, and they are shamelessness and lack of modesty. Now, if you were to ask me what's the difference, well, I don't know, but there's a Buddha Gosa, I think it's here right in your library. You could probably read several pages on it. These guys were quite brainy, and they developed on this a lot. So you get the idea of these okay, I'll do one more of these. The 10 defiled factors of limited extent: anger, hypocrisy, stinginess, envy, ill-motivated rivalry, the causing of harm, enmity, deceit, trickery, and arrogance. These have been bad ones we've seen, but they're not all bad. There are good things too. There are things that are neutral, neither good nor bad. They're simply the analysis of the contents of experience. So these dharmas are right at the... See, dharma is different than the Hindu dharma, like the Dharma Raj, who always behaves well. It's not that anymore. These are... You could call them like the atoms, but they're not things. They're factors giving rise to experience. They're the dynamos, they're the causes of experience which arise dependently always. And all of this experience is false and illusory, and the purpose is to get out of it. So this is the third... Does this make sense?
Mm-hmm.
I'm just doing my best. I'm not a a great
So
expert.
these dharmas are not jewels.
They're not jewels, no, not at all. Although some of them might be, minor, I don't know, nice pieces of quartz or something. They're not all bad. I mean, a lot of them are good if you read the whole list of them.
You've only put down the bad ones.
Yeah, I know. It's sort of like when you read Dante's Inferno. Somehow, Divine Comedy, somehow the Inferno is always where one goes to. It sounds a lot more interesting than Paradiso. These devils are... I've also noticed whenever I'm traveling around America, whenever I get to National Park, whenever there's some very interesting or exotic or striking feature, it's always the Devil's Gorge or the Devil's Canyon or the Devil's Stream. God never came up with anything interesting. Only the devil did. So in that philosophy, I've given you all the bad things for dharmas.
It's a code of conduct for becoming a celebrity, I think.
Hey, you have to, conform to
You have
the
to get good
devil.
at
Yeah.
that. Really good.
So you have, in all the different schools, they'll have their own Tripitakas, their own, the Tripitakas, the Vinaya, which is the monastic rules of discipline, the Sutras, which are accounts, I don't think all of them, I'm not quite sure, but they have Buddha's words, accounts of the words of the Buddha are in them, and maybe other things too. And then the Abhidharma, came up after maybe 200 years, and it's an analysis. It's like Buddha was the doctor, right? He presented himself as giving the remedy to suffering. That was his task. And this is the science of medicine, you might say, that arose. The full analysis, the developed analysis of all the... And it's moving in the direction of a metaphysics, in that it's starting to try to account for everything in the world of experience. But it always retains its orientation, its experiential elements, right? All of these are. It's not like a physicist would go and say, well, there's a deceit particle, or there's a trickery atom, or, there's a causing of harm, tree, or something like that. Buddhism really is looking at it from the standpoint of experience from this goal, but it's starting to attribute a reality to these things. It's starting to become more of a metaphysics and more of an ontology. I'm moving towards Nagarjuna now, who attacked all of this. And some of the schools, they became very articulate on this point as to whether these dharmas are real or not, and to what is real. And they tended to, let me show you, here are some of the other great schools, just so you've seen these names. I know this is a lot of stuff. Let's see. I must have put down the 4 schools somewhere. Anyway, it'll probably show up later. But at this point, there were 2 really important schools. We're about, say, the 1st century BC or something like that. And the 2 main schools were called Vaibhasika and Saupranika. And they disagreed on certain important things, which I won't try to go into. But they both affirmed that dharmas really exist. They had different views on how this could be so. But they did affirm that this is reality. So you're getting to a metaphysics now. We're getting towards an ontology. And I mentioned this last time, but a big part of this had to do with the doctrine of momentariness. Do you remember that from last time? Momentariness. And this has to do with those 3 marks of existence. Everything is impermanent, everything is suffering, and everything is soulless, or not self. The way that they interpreted that was to say that nothing endures from one instant to the next. Everything is completely passing. So, we have a Kim here. Well, this Kim now is not the same as when I said it 5 seconds ago. It's completely different. There's no continuity. Nothing lasts for more than a single moment. It's a very extreme view, right? I mean, it's very counterintuitive. And that would have to do, it would be explicable through the Buddhist account of causation, that each moment is the causal factor for the next moment. So you have a continuous string of becoming. It's that wheel going on. So the Steve of this instant is creating the Steve of the next instant, Steve of the next instant. But they're really not the same individual at all, because there is no such thing as Steve. It's completely a falsehood. So this doctrine, so you might say if we're going to use the idea of atoms, these dharmas are atoms and they exist on a moment by moment kind of basis, right? Do you follow this idea?
Mm.
It's a very radical idea. And there was it goes totally against common sense. And there are great attempts to explain it. One of the metaphors used would be a stream, and that's still used to this very day. It's like we have John here, and John is a stream, and we think he goes on and on being. But in fact, if you look at the water, it's never the same water at all. There's really no such thing as John there. But there's a constant chain of succession of one thing leading on and on to the next, which creates the illusion of a John when he's really not there. So you see how this is actually true to the original doctrines as they understood them. Do you get this idea?
Yeah,
Mm.
I like it.
Yeah, it's a very radical idea, actually. Shankara, tore it to pieces as he did everything Buddhist, but 8 centuries later. I'll say a little bit about this. There are questions dividing these two schools on time, whether time is real. And there's a lot of Buddhist analysis on the 3 points of time. That would be the past, the present, and the future. And the Vaibhasika schools believed that all of them are real. And the Sautranika school said only the present moment is real, nothing else is real. So they are starting to raise these ontological questions of what is real and associating it with this whole thing of these dharmas. So this is a lot of what Nagarjuna responded to and attacked, and this is where the whole doctrine of emptiness comes up in the next century. So that's kind of what I had to say about early Buddhism.
Dale, it all looks faintly ridiculous from our point of view, but in fact it must have taught amazing mental skills, refinement of thinking, using words with precision, so that communication between human beings became much more defined than it had ever been before or since. Developing a conceptual universe beyond our dreams, really, and designed, of course, to help the individual field of experiencing avoid the cravings and that lead to suffering. So advancing people towards equipoise and in positive indifference to things through this hyper-activity of the conceptual mind.
No, that's very well described.
And of course the the later development of Buddhism, which didn't start till much after this, is to do a similar sort of thing with internal energies, picking it up from Tantra and so on.
Right.
And again, this extraordinary achievement of working with consciousness of your inner energies rather than your concepts gave birth to a whole civilization later on. But
Yeah.
that's it from this.
Yes, yes. The Vajrayana, especially, which grew out of the Yogacara.
So there must have been also a great generation of new terms, new abstract terms
Oh yeah, yeah,
that came up and got discriminated and named.
yeah. Yes, yes.
Yeah.
That must be so.
A lot of these must be new words.
Yes.
Until Nagarjuna came along and deconstructed a lot of it.
A massive attack on the whole thing.
Yeah.
Although in a way he didn't attack it. I mean, in a sense, he just looked at it from a different point of view.
Oh, so you're going to get to saying what he did?
Yeah, let's see. Shall I jump right to Nagarjuna? Why don't I jump right to him?
Yeah.
And then I'll come back to more about Mahayana. Okay, let me say a little bit about the emergence of Mahayana, which seems to have happened, maybe the first. So I spent about 3 hours yesterday and today getting these Abhidharma factors, lists of them, to give some idea of what they are. But the Mahayana emerged maybe something like the 1st century in the AD. And I'm just going to flip this out there with please use your critical discriminations on this matter. But there may be a connection with what Baba has said about Jesus. As you know, Baba said he was buried in Kashmir. And I gather, Tien was saying, that I've heard this, and I can't remember if I've read it or not, but that Baba said he traveled there. Well, Mahayana, where it originated, there are a lot of accounts saying it came out of the south of India somewhere. But another early point of origination may indeed be Kashmir. There was 3 Buddhist councils I mentioned. There was actually what they call a 4th. There were 2 of them, and the 2nd happened in Kashmir under a great monarch in Kashmir. Kanishka was his name, in the year 72 A.D. And apparently some of the major Mahayana doctrines do seem to have been supported by him and propagated there. So Jesus would seem to have come to Kashmir shortly before that. So it does bring up the possibility that there's a link.
He was the spiritual advisor to Kanishka.
Let me see, I have it down here. I have it presided over by Vasumitra. I have that much.
No, but he would have died by then, probably.
Jesus,
I
yeah.
don't know whether he died, but he was the spiritual advisor to Kanishka. After he died, a Buddhist monk became the spiritual advisor.
Well, yeah, I don't know. I
This
don't
is
know
a
about.
document I saw on YouTube, made by the Indian government.
Yeah, okay. A lot of these things I would want to see the evidence myself, but I'm not saying it's not true.
But there were coins Kanishka, the emperor, made that you can see in the British Museum.
Yeah.
It's Buddha name on the coin, gold coin.
Yeah. Anyway, this is a very interesting link that maybe the Avatar had to do with the emergence of Mahayana. And one of the, I'll say this, of the great themes of Mahayana is a new ideal of the kind of person to become. Under the pre-existing Buddhism, the mainstream Buddhism before this, the goal was to become an arahat, which is actually the word gets used very loosely. Sometimes I read these early accounts and it seems like everybody and his brother was becoming an arahat. It sounds like a seeker. But the real thing would be someone who pursues the path to the annihilation of self and achieves nirvana. That was the goal, right? But under the emergence of Mahayana, this was seemed to be, I'll say this, I don't know if they would use this word, they probably would use much harsher words, selfish. You're just doing it for yourself and you're not looking at the well-being of the world. So some of these Mahayana texts are very rough and tough and harsh and denunciatory in their language towards the earlier Buddhism. The Hinayana is, quite in keeping with this sort of a putanishness of it. I'm just saying this so that if you're dealing with Theravada Buddhists, I sort of support being respectful to whoever they may be.
It's not really selfish.
No, it isn't really, but that was seen that way. And a new ideal of the bodhisattva who puts off liberation, nirvana, until every being in creation has achieved it, gets it then. Now that would seem to last for a long time. The Buddhists, some of these cosmologies go for their innumerable universes and they last forever and forever. But you get the idea. In other words, you serve the world, you help the world in its search for spiritual truth. Spiritual liberation, it's not charity, it's not social work, it's service could be involved, but the purpose is to help all other beings in creation. And thus a whole pantheon of Mahayana bodhisattvas starts to emerge. This is another thing that happened with the emergence of Mahayana. You start to get, when you read the Lotus Sutra, I'm saying this a little bit facetiously. Have any of you read the Lotus Sutra? It made me think of a rock concert where, actually, it's on Vulture Peak and Buddha is discoursing and these various bodhisattvas come up and speak and the crowd goes wild as they propound their truth. And I'm being a little bit facetious about it, but you suddenly have all these, they're like deities, although they're not deities, they're bodhisattvas. And also in the Lotus Sutra, the Buddha himself becomes eternal. He's not a man who died. He was always there and will always there, and all the Buddhas are eternal beings. So thus, as time goes on, you can pray to a Buddha, you can worship Buddhas, Buddhas will show mercy on you. So you have an opening to a bhakti path now, which really had not been much there before. And devotional Buddhism came to birth. We don't hear much about devotional Buddhism in the West, but actually it's very popular. Maybe the most popular Buddhism is Pure Land Buddhism. I don't know the exact numbers, but is that?
It is the most popular in mainland China.
Yeah, in Japan it's very popular too. Amida Buddhism. And it's all about remembering the Buddha, adoring the Buddha, taking the Buddha's name. There was a saying, if something like this, I forget who these characters, they're Japanese saints of like the 10th, 11th, 12th century. One of them said, if even a sinner can go to paradise, how much more can a saint or a real seeker of the Buddha? And 100 years later, someone said, if even a saint can go to paradise, how much more so can a wretched sinner? In other words, your merit, your deserving, your good or badness is nothing before the grace of the Buddha. Throw yourself on his mercy, throw yourself on his grace, and that's the only thing that can save you. So this is, you get the idea here? So this
Sounds familiar.
Yeah. If even a saint can go to paradise, how much more so can a wretched sinner, As though that recommends you. You know,
All my righteousness is as filthy rags, as St. Paul says.
yes, that very idea was there. So you have the emergence of this of a devotionalism. I'm using the word bhakti. Of course, that word didn't come up even in India until 5th or 6th century with Shaivism and Vaishnavism. Bhakti didn't really emerge in Hinduism until then. But the roots of it are right from the beginning of Mahayana. So that's one big thing. Okay, in a little bit, I guess maybe this will have to continue next week. I sort of thought this might happen. I don't know, Jeff, if you're willing to talk about Tibetan Buddhism next week.
I should be still around.
You should listen around.
Already.
But will Tibetan Buddhism still be around? I mean, we're in a momentary universe. It'll be a completely different Jeff and a completely different Tibetan Buddhism by next week.
Sounds like Philip K. Dick to me.
Great writer.
I'll begin with a little bit of Nagarjuna and go on with him more next time. Yeah, here's one of the bodhisattvas, a bodhisattva of compassion.
Mm.
And, okay, I'll say something about that next week. Try to note that. But here's this, I found out we have it in the library. I just downloaded this online. We have it. This is a translation of Nagarjuna's most famous work, great work. It's called the Mulya Madhyamika Karika. And Karika means book. And Madhyamika is that school that he's the founder of. He and his disciple, Aryaveda, but no, I've forgotten his disciple's name, is also credited with founding this.
When was that period?
No one is entirely sure, but something like 150 to 250 AD.
You only can check that book out if you can say the name.
You have to say it.
Yeah.
Mulla Madhyamaka Karika. Actually, Mulla Madhyamaka, which is the name of the school, and Karika, which means book.
Oh.
Excludes you, Dan.
Huh?
Excludes Dan. He won't be checking it out.
I have a hard enough time with my name. So.
The middle way, this is in a brief account of why he would call that the middle way. He's talking about, I'll say focusing on dharmas. He strongly attacked this, not the standing of dharmas. And he was negotiating between two extremes. One extreme is that dharmas are real and eternal, right? And the other extreme is that that's the eternalist view. And the other view is the annihilationist view. That is that a dharma is annihilated every moment, right? Those two views are the extremes, the eternalist and the annihilationist. The middle way was to say that they don't exist at all. Nice solution, right? Thus, we get to the idea that I wrote there on there, shunyata. If you know one thing from, I won't say Mahayana, because there are other things, but the Madhyamika school, which is the philosophical center of Mahayana Buddhism, it would be that idea, emptiness. Everything is empty. That was what he was arguing. And I'll jump right now. Actually, when I've read it 3 times and have understood it about 1%.
Well, what he's saying is it's there, but it's empty.
It's there, but it's empty.
Yeah. It's not that it's annihilated. It's
Yes.
still there, but it's empty. Yeah.
An extreme would be to say that it's really there,
Yeah.
and the other opposite extreme would be to say that nothing is there. It's there, but it's empty. That's the middle position. And so now we're starting to get to something much more like an ontology, an ontological account. That is what really exists. Buddhism has really gone all the way. Coming, though, from this experiential angle. By the way, this Abhidharma, I should also say about this, remember that there was a vast theoretical development that led to the Abhidharma. But this is all in a context of meditation also. And that really is true from Buddhism all the way through. These were people who would meditate, so they weren't just formulating ideas in their head. It was related to, I mean, if you spend, I don't know, 10 hours a day meditating, you're going to have a lot of experience of these things. I don't know how long they're... Did they have unions back then? 40 hours of meditation only per week, weekends off?
I just wonder the relationship with Nagarjuna and the Diamond Sutra. Is it derived based on the sutras?
The first great Mahayana sutras are the Prajnaparamitra sutras. I had something about that there. And they...
Diamond Sutra is within it, isn't it?
Yeah, it's within that. And the story is, there are a lot of legends about Nagarjuna, and who knows. But the story is that he recovered these sutras given by the Buddha from the realm of the Nagas, which are the snakes, and he brought them out.
Hence his name.
Yeah.
Yes, it is related, yeah, Nagarjuna. But I don't know if that story relates to his name or not. Yeah. In fact, there are a whole bunch of new sutras. The Vajrayana, and what's the name of, I forget the name of the Sanskrit name of the Diamond Sutra, the Heart Sutra. But there are many new sutras, and the Mahayana Buddhists would say that these were actually given by the Buddha, but stored. Some of them were stored in the Tushita heaven. If you guys have stowed Baba's book in some such place, time to bring it out. But and then the Naga realm has a lot of these others, and they were revealed to the world then. That's how it's understood within.
It's a bit like Baoji's Awakening book, eh?
Yeah.
It's
Stored.
very different. The sutras are attributed to the Buddha himself. Baoji is Baoji.
Yeah.
Even though he did say Baba said this, Baba said that.
But so the Prajnaparamitra sutras are give expression to a lot of the themes that Nagarjuna really developed, especially shunyata, the theme of emptiness. You see it really developed there. So the idea of emptiness, the name to link that with really is Nagarjuna. Some scholars say that the idea had been developed before him, but he was the one who really, he was an intellectual giant. Probably a spiritual giant. I asked Bal Natu about Nagarjuna one time, and Bal said, I don't know. But Bal was very respectful, and Bal said he's an intellectual giant. No doubt about that.
Did Bal Natu have a background in Buddhist study?
No, but he knew about such things. Of course he knew who Nagarjuna was. I mean, someone like Bal, clearly.
Well, not all the Mandali would have.
No.
I don't think they would have. A lot of the Zoroastrians, would have had no reason to.
So
Bal was a Hindu, but he also was somebody who took an interest in things like this. Although he was much more a Bhagavad Gita guy than a Mullah, Madhyamika, Karika guy.
Sounds like a Hawaiian song.
Huh?
Sounds like a Hawaiian song.
Yeah, I know we should get Mark to write now that he's finished with Keel Mountain. The name of it would be a whole line. And how do you find a rhyme? So okay, we'll have to continue with this next week, but let me say this. This was a very key doctrine relevant to all of us. I'll talk next week about his attack on the idea of dharmas. He wasn't actually, again, attacking like you were just saying. He's attacking their substantiality. The term used was swabhava, which means own existence or own becoming. We could use the word essence. There is essentially nothing there. They're empty.
You can see the way it's grown out of the earlier Buddhism.
Yes, it beautifully develops. And we're actually getting an ontology here, an account of the universe. The universe is empty. There is nothing there. But when I read it, every time I read this thing, it's not that long. If you take away the commentary, it's only about 30 pages, but every couplet is holy smokes. But I felt like I was going through a meat grinder. And every sort of like, if you think this, you're wrong. Oh, okay. Well, if you think that, you're wrong. Okay. Well, if you think this and that, you're wrong. And if you think neither this nor that, you're wrong. It's like, well, what the hell am I supposed to think? It's like, I've never read such a book. It annihilates every way of conceptualizing things. I've never read a book like that before.
It annihilates that superior standpoint of judging, which is behind the whole scientific view of the world.
Wow. Oh,
So there are people who, there are a lot of disagreements about Nagarjuna, what his shunyata is. But one point of view that I tend to think is true is that he was attacking attempts to understand and formulate, in that you simply cannot understand. There's no formulation without it. Okay, I haven't said that properly. I'll try again next week. But here's the doctrine I wanted to get to. At the end of he attacks all the central Buddhist doctrines. It's like, why didn't they hang this guy as a heretic? How is he a Buddhist? Not peripheral things, big things. He devastates. And then, in the last two books, all of a sudden he trots them all back and they're all there again. What happened? I thought you annihilated. This is the enemy you mowed down. And here's the doctrine that's really important and relevant to us, is that he differentiated between levels of truth. There's ultimate truth and there's conventional truth. And by conventional truth would be all the standard Buddhist doctrines. It would be the reality of the world as we see it. And ultimate truth is shunyata, this emptiness. And if you're speaking on the level of truth, none of these fundamental Buddhist doctrines are true. But on the conventional level of truth that we actually experience, those things fully pertain to the lives we lead. See? Now, I think we as Baba lovers hold to something similar to that. That is, Baba says, all this is a dream, God alone is real. But do you experience that? I don't. I accept it to be so. But this is the conventional truth that we all accept. We're in the bookstore and it's, such and such a date and all of that.
And that's what I was going to say. Baba says that it's all an illusion.
Yeah.
And that's the same thing as emptiness.
Yeah.
Nothing. Not there. Not real.
This will be a very big question in the future about the idea of emptiness as articulated by Nagarjuna and Baba's the nothing. Are they the same thing or aren't they? And Buddhists would have very different opinions on that.
It looks like the nirvana, the Buddha points and what Nagarjuna talks like shunyata. It's more like beyond state of God, in the 10th state of God.
Well, we'll see. Okay, well it's 12 o'clock, so we should break. So next week we'll finish up with the history of Buddhism. Like that.
Yeah.
Okay, Deva.